Is quite a special month for the BKs worldwide because we have a special month of meditation, really, not to worship anyone or venerate anyone, but just to be inspired by someone's life who really attained very elevated spiritual state. So I never met Brahma Baba, and yet I'm going to share my story about him with you. And I want to be really open just to share my experience. And I hope you accept this with that open heart too. It's just my own feeling of him. And just to tell you a little bit about myself, I live in Sydney. And just before we came on, I was saying yesterday it was 38 degrees centigrade. Very, very hot at the moment. It's a wonderful world, isn't it? I'm on Monday morning. You're on Sunday night. You're in winter. I'm in summer. But I began my spiritual journey in London. I was living in London in the 70s. And I went along to the Brahma Kumari Center, which was very small in those days. And there was a picture of Brahma Baba there. And to be very open, I loved his face. His face was extremely kind and gentle and peaceful. But I had a resistance to gurus. There was something about gurus that I was not comfortable about at all. And that was my immediate impression. There's a photo, and you can see there's a photo I put behind me today. And so that was my sort of initial feeling. But then it was explained to me that really he is not a guru. He's like an extraordinary example of someone who imbibed the depth of spirituality because of his love for God. And he became instrumental for God's teachings in this organization. So just to sort of keep me on track this time, I've got a few notes that I've sort of jotted down here. So just to keep the thread of the story aligned. And as Nabi was saying, he was born in a province of what is now Pakistan. It was India, called Sindh in 1876. And his home was a very simple home. His father was a school teacher, and he was brought up as a Hindu. And yet quite quickly in his life, he established quite a successful jewelry business. And maybe 6 or 7 years ago, I was in Pakistan and I was in Karachi, where he lived for some time, and I went to his home. Absolutely magnificent and beautiful home. So he did extremely well in his business. He was extremely successful. And once I was also in Kolkata, which is an extraordinary city, maybe 25 million people plus. And he had his business there. And one of his relatives took me to show me the shop, which was pretty much the same. Now, this is some time ago. It was in the 1980s. But I got a real feeling of this man's transformation, what he was before. Because he was in business, he was a jeweler, and actually he was dealing with a lot of the princes and princesses of India. And the time that India came together as one country, in a sense, excuse my throat, there was around 600 or 700 Maharajas, little kingdoms within India. And Brahma Baba did a lot of work with a lot of these Maharajas. He did a lot of his business with them. And so he was quite a established person. And the whole feeling, trying to paint a picture, a story, was it was British India. It was British India at the time. And he was a part of this whole environment, moving between what is now Pakistan, Karachi and Hyderabad and Calcutta, and visiting his clients all over the country. And just to give you an idea of India in those days, in the 1950s or so, of the 10 richest people in the world, 5 or more were Maharajas. It was an extraordinarily wealthy country, or at least the Maharajas at that time, even though the people themselves were often very, very poor. So just to give you also a feeling of him and his family, he had an arranged marriage and had 5 children. So that's totally normal at that time. And he was like a devoted husband and father. And even though he was devoted to his family and his business, his real passion was his spiritual journey. And there's like a system within India from the Vedas that a traditional life for a male, for a man, is 4 periods, 4 phases. One is as a child, the next as a young person, growing up. And the third is really having or becoming a student. Sorry, the second is like a student, you study. The third is where you have your family. And the fourth is something which they call Wanprasth, and often around the age of late 50s, early 60s. And this means like a retirement. And in those days, often they would take on a spiritual teacher and really dedicate their life to God and prepare for death, prepare for moving on. So Brahma Baba was really at that sort of period of his life. But over his life, he had become, even though he was dedicated to his own spiritual journey, he became quite disillusioned with religion. He had many experiences because he had many gurus. His search was so strong. And one of his gurus actually gambled on horses, lost some money, asked him for money. And once he also went up to Kashmir, where there's a very, very famous temple up there called Amarnath, which means the Lord of Immortality. It's like a Shiva temple. And one of the traditions of Hinduism, there's an ice Shiva lingam, if you know the traditions of Hinduism. And they say that it's a natural thing. It just forms naturally. And this is like the superstitious beliefs of those of a Hindu background. And he used to sort of believe this too, because we have that faith and dedication. But when he went there, and it's quite a trek to get there, he arrived in the early morning to pray and meditate, and he saw the priests packing up this ice Shiva lingam. So he began to realize that what you're told and what the reality is something which is quite different. And he found that the temples were extremely dirty and noisy. And so, that conflict inside, you really want the spirituality, and yet what you see doesn't match with what you feel you should be having. And yet he would read the scriptures. He would read the Gita, which is the main scripture of people of a Hindu background. He would read the Granth, which is the Sikh scripture. He was well versed in the Quran and the Bible. He had this love for all traditions as well. And then living his life in his business, caring for his family. Just out of the blue in the early 1930s, he had a few visions. And the first vision was like a cataclysmic upheaval in our world. And it was just out of the blue. Just imagine if you had this vivid vision of massive upheaval. He saw natural calamities wiping out cities. He saw war and famine and so many things. And quite frankly, it left him in shock. There was no context to this vision. Where did it come from? What was it about? And for a few days, his family said he hardly spoke. He was in this deep state of reflection. And then a few days later, he had another vision, but it was the opposite. And this was like a vision of these beautiful stars coming out from the sky and landing in the foreheads of like divine human beings. Some may call them deities, and he could see they were absolutely peaceful, pure, and loving. And as much as the first vision gave him sorrow, that That's how much the second vision actually gave him so much happiness as well. But still, he was wondering, what is the context of all of this? And these two visions really kick-started an extraordinary sort of transformation in Brahma Baba. He changed dramatically to the point that even his family became quite concerned because he let go his gurus who he was so dedicated to. He stopped worshipping. He even let go his business. And so almost in a short period of time, this massive shift began within him. And he began to sit in silence and meditation a lot. So he was trying to understand what was happening, what was this process that was happening to him internally. And then when other people would come in front of him, some would see light, some would have visions, and have such a feeling of love and a purity emanating from him. And I think that even he didn't really, for a little while, understand what was really happening to him. But he began to realize this is not him. There's some other power coming through him. And in time, he understood that he was becoming an instrument for the Supreme Soul. And we knew Brahma Baba was the human being, but another soul was literally coming into his forehead, sitting beside him and starting to even begin to speak through him. And this one we began to call Shiv Baba, the Supreme Soul. So Brahma Baba, a human being like us, a family, a business, but this other soul, this pure soul, this divine being began to speak through him. And at this time, a little community began to form around him because people were having visions, light. And the wonder sort of is that even Brahma Baba himself was learning, and that was always his style, his whole life. He always saw himself as an instrument and a student. He never saw himself as a guru or an authority in that way, and remained a remarkably humble person. And in a little bit of time, some teachings began to emerge with the soul of the Supreme Soul sitting and speaking through him. He became instrumental. And the first real teaching, and this is around 1936 and 37, was around the eternal self, the soul. Now, 80% of us understand that we're something more than a body. 80% of human beings believe we're something more than this temporary physical form. We have an innate sense. I think I did from the day I can remember, and I think many of us do. But exactly what this entity is and how it moves in its journey, we're not really sure. And so the Supreme Soul began to use the mouth of Brahma and clarify the understanding of the self, that the soul is a wonder, that all of us are a soul. And in the womb, the soul enters the body when the quickening begins, the movement in the womb. That's the arrival of the little soul. This soul is just a point. In mathematics, a point exists but has no size. It's absolutely, totally, and utterly subtle. And yet I, the soul, and this was the teaching, am immortal, I can never die, eternal, and I'm a non-physical entity. And so as he began to build the picture of the soul, he began to build the picture that my original consciousness was to be aware. I lived my life as a soul, so I had no fear of death at all. But over a long period of time, I lost the awareness of the eternal self and only took on the awareness of the temporary self, the body, and became body conscious. And the more I became body conscious, I lost my truth. I put myself under the influence of falsehood and deception. And so I began to fear death, and a whole lot of negativity began to emerge. And so the Supreme Soul began to reveal the soul, reveal the original consciousness of the soul. and start to begin to teach how to re-emerge my original soul conscious state once again. Because when I am self-aware, I am naturally peaceful, happy, and loving. So this teaching began about the original self. And then he began to even introduce himself through the mouth of Brahma. So as I said, I'm being very open with you, my understanding here. Could you imagine another soul sitting in you and using your mouth and speaking? And even Brahma himself was hearing and learning. And this soul introduced himself as well. And he said that I am Shiva. And in other traditions, you may call it Jehovah or Allah, a unique soul. But out of all souls, I don't take birth and rebirth. And I come at the end of a cycle of time to remind you who you are, take you back into a soul conscious state by connecting or reconnecting with me. And so the Supreme Soul is just like the soul too, just a point, but eternally clean, eternally uninfluenced, eternally pure, and eternally retaining truth. And so he started to build a picture of who he was and began to say to really heal this internal state that we've all experienced, a state of unhappiness and sorrow, which virtually all human beings are feeling. First, become aware of my original self, the soul, and second, begin to remember the Supreme Soul. And these two are the fundamental steps of self-transformation and this deep healing inside. And he began to talk in a way, giving the understanding that this spirituality is different from all the religion that we've been taught. That in fact, human beings are never God, and God is not everywhere, but God is a unique soul, but a pure soul. And at this time, this soul comes to influence the world by reconnecting us with our true selves and with him. And one way I understand it, and Brahma Baba would talk about this, is that there's 4 levels of consciousness, we can say. One is a gross consciousness, which we all know, where I sort of think I'm a temporary body. My whole attitude or consciousness is external, extrovert. And life is just watching all the scenes of life, all the personalities, all the behaviors, just engaged on a day-to-day level in that way. I experience life through my sense organs. The second is like a creative consciousness of an artist or a musician or a scientist, that I'm not extrovert. The mind isn't outside. The mind's internalized, creating beautiful images or music or great ideas. So it's a higher consciousness. The third is what he called subtle consciousness. And this is where a lot of the great figures in history, Christ and Buddha, and some great saints and sages, they're very elevated. And so when we remember them, we connect with them, we have that consciousness, we get peace, we get love, we get something. But he said there's even a higher consciousness when I remember the original form of God, which is just this point of life energy, the eternal form of the divine. Why? Because when I remember the great saints and sages and teachers of history, they have a human form, so I remain body conscious. But when I remember the Supreme Soul, I start to become soul conscious too. So this incredible transformation begins. And in a sense, it's just going back to my original state. And so he began to teach about the self. He began to teach about the divine, and he began to teach about time. And he said right from the beginning in the 1930s that time moves in a cycle, and that we've all been on this incredible journey, but we've come to a point where we're so lost from the original state of the self, of being peaceful, loving, and happy. And we're becoming engrossed in sensual things. And we've become completely, shall we, body conscious. And this is the sign of an end of a cycle and a beginning. It's like the end of winter and the beginning of spring. So he called this period of time a confluence of an old consciousness, based on falsehood and, temporary things, to rebuilding a new consciousness based on truth and permanent things. And so that we're in this incredible cycle. And he began to say that there will be a lot of upheaval, like his vision at the end of this period, but it will give birth to a heaven, a golden age, a paradise, a society, a real society of human beings in their elevated state, something which is remembered in all the old indigenous cultures and the religions of the world. So, as you could imagine, he began to teach this. And it was a very conservative society in the 1930s in Sindh, in this province of India. And they loved him. He was a very highly respected person, but all these new ideas, because they didn't see who was speaking them through him, there was a huge reaction to him. And because it was a very traditional and conservative society. And one of the things that he did right from the beginning is he put the women in front in the organization. This was absolutely radical at that time. You could probably say the attitude to women, a lot of girls, as soon as they reached puberty, they were engaged and married. So 12, 13, 14 years, they were bearing children. And they were often uneducated. Their role was to look after the children and keep the home. And in my understanding, sometimes they weren't allowed out of the home without their husband's permission. So this was sort of a painting, once again, a picture of the culture and the society that was there. And then he gave all this responsibility of this organization to women. And there was huge opposition to him at the time. And his great respect went in the other way. And there was demonstrations, excuse me, even court cases and such things. There was a lot of opposition because this was something which was completely radical. Excuse me one sec. I'm sorry about that. And yet he had an incredible, his business was very successful. He was a very wealthy person, but he made a trust and gave all his wealth to 12 mothers. He gave the highest regard to women. Sometimes in the culture at that time, there was a saying, women were the gateway to hell. And he changed that saying to women were the gateway to heaven. And it's an amazing story, I feel, because this little gathering in Karachi, in Pakistan, they were there for like 14 years, meditating, studying, learning, practicing soul consciousness, remembering God. And there was just a few hundred of them. Now, there's a huge organization in India and around the world of Brahma Kumaris, who are women who run meditation centers. And only recently I was in India and I went to the person who looks after all the administration statistics. He was telling me now in India alone, there's 55,000 centers and sub-centers. That's huge. And something like 25,000 surrendered sisters. So from this incredibly humble beginning, he was the instrument, Brahma Baba, to create the largest spiritual organization in the world run by women. So it's an extraordinary story, a really extraordinary story. And I think it really hit me once how radical this really was, is because in all religions and traditions, it's usually a male-dominated sort of scenario. And I went to a place called Surat in Gujarat. Um, and Gujarat is in northwestern India. And Abdul Kalam, who was the president of India at that time, had called all the interfaith leaders to a Jain temple for a gathering. He wanted to inspire them for communal harmony and respect. And it was a beautiful, beautiful temple. And I had the fortune to accompany a few of the sisters, the Brahma Kumaris. And they sat in a huge circle, all these religious leaders. And there was a lot of people there, but in the inner circle, there was like 20 leaders, major leaders of Hinduism, Christianity, Islam, Jews, all of them were there. There was only one group of women, and that was the Brahma Kumaris. And that's when I really sort of touched me. What an incredible thing he really did. Not that he was trying to say that men are not good or whatever, but to really empower everybody by empowering women. Because even in the religious communities in those days, sometimes, you know, the guru wasn't allowed to see the women, the face of women. They would have to sit at the back or behind screens. And so this incredible story began. And the community moved from Hyderabad, where it started, into Karachi. They had this 14 years. And this training that Brahma Baba gave these young women, and he would get them to, you know, do things like fixing cars and doing building, to get out of the identification with the labels of the body. You know, because the soul has no gender. The soul's not male and female. And he'd get the men also to do the cooking and cleaning. Not, he'd get them to do everything, but to start to really look at myself and be aware that I'm a soul, rather than just dancing to the tune of what society expects a male to do or a female to do. And they began to wear white. And I think most of you who know the Brahma Kumaris. And one of the reasons was just simplicity, to get us out of this sort of identification with my image and my clothes. And so this white really was just there for simplicity, but it has become like the uniform of the Brahma Kumaris, but also like a symbol of purity and simplicity. And he created this whole daily timetable to wake up early in the morning around 3, 4 a.m. and have meditation. Because he would say, if we have this deep connection with the divine, with God at that time, then that will influence my whole day. Then after that, they would have study. And so the Supreme Soul would enter and speak the teachings. And all the teachings really came through the understanding from the Supreme Soul and the experience of Brahma Baba, a great combination. And then during the day, they'd all do their work, but they were all really encouraged to do it in this consciousness of soul and also remembering God. The main message was, the subtle link of my intellect is with God, I'm under a powerful influence. The more I remember my relatives, the past, it drains me and takes me back into my old story. So Brahma Baba, was not a guru, as I said, but really was a deep practitioner of soul consciousness and remembrance. He saw himself not as the teacher, but as a student, even though teachings were coming through. And he was incredibly loving, extremely loving. And I remember one of the brothers who was in Mumbai saying how his mother was attending classes and he went up to meet Brahma Baba. And at the time of partition between India and Pakistan, you may know this upheaval in the late 40s and early 50s, the Brahma Kumaris moved to Mount Abu, which is in Rajasthan. And so he went up there to meet Brahma Baba in this simple little ashram that the Brahma Kumaris had. And he had a lot of different ideas, and she said he argued with him a lot, argued about this. He was a professor of philosophy. But when he was leaving, he said, he was taking leave, saying goodbye. And he said, Brahma Baba had tears of love in his eyes. And he said, I'd argued with this person. I'd really been quite rude. And yet this person maintained love. And that really attracted him to something much deeper here than comes to the eyes. He was very loving and extremely humble. Didn't like photos of himself because, you know, this guru culture is so deep that we venerate the human being, but he really wanted everyone to connect with the Supreme Soul and not look at him. So he didn't like photos of himself, and he's always the awareness that I'm just an instrument. Don't look at me, look at the one who is really teaching me and helping me change. And he was absolutely consistent in this and remained completely simple. And he was very much honest, straight. Even though he was an extraordinary inspiration in his own life, he would say so openly his own challenges, his own efforts when they worked and they didn't work. So he was not only an inspiration, but he was very real as well, that I'm on the journey too. The Supreme Soul, Shiva, eternally pure, never influenced. Me, I'm a soul that's taken birth and rebirth. I have my karmic story. I'm like all of you. I have to make effort to transform myself. So he remained very humble and very relatable. And he was an absolute student himself. He never really saw himself as a teacher, but more he was learning as well. And his main foundation was this incredibly deep love and recognition of God. And the way I see him, he just fell in love completely. And I think his whole approach wasn't religious at all. It was almost like, I think he saw a spiritual life as something so natural. When you fall in love, like a lover, a real lover with a soul, the Supreme Soul, you naturally remember that. And the more you naturally remember God or the divine, you naturally transform. And the more you naturally transform, you naturally radiate a different vibration. You uplift and serve all those around. But, you know, the partition, this was really in Karachi, and then they moved over into India after partition, as I was just saying. And there was huge upheaval at that time. I don't know, there's different figures. Some say 1 million died, some say many millions died, and it was like a slaughter between Hindus and Muslims. A very, very sad time. But I came to Mount Abu myself in 1975. So it was nearly 40 years after the beginning. But it was still incredibly simple. There was a real simplicity. There wasn't any pomp and show, because the real focus of everybody was this deep spiritual practice, but not through pressure, through force, through I have to, I must do, but this through love and wisdom, this really beautiful atmosphere. The atmosphere, I found there absolutely extraordinary. And when groups of people would meditate, you know, when we meditated together, it was just so uplifting. But when they first came to India in the early 1950s, they began to open centers around India, and they had very little. And yet Brahma Baba would sustain them. He would sustain them, you know, with letters and things like that, and they would travel and meet him. It was a very, very simple, but the Brahma Kumaris in their white saris became known all over India. And then on the 18th of January, and this is why January is special, one night Brahma Baba had an evening class. This is in 1969. And he did the class and he went into his room, and Daddy Prakashmani, who was one of the original sisters, and she became the new instrument later. She followed him into his room, and he lay down and held her hand, and slowly, slowly she felt the energy leave and the soul flew away. That this soul, we understand, settled his karmic account and literally became an angel. An angel meaning that he's still serving, still giving, but not through a physical form, through a body of light. And he was around the early 90s at that time. And this was a big thing because they hadn't expected him to leave. He was quite healthy at the time. And so on the 21st of January, at those days, there was some sisters who would go into trance, and this had been a feature from the beginning, and they would get messages from Shiv Baba through this trance state. But in these 3 days, no one could do that. And on the 21st of January, Dadi Gulzar, one of the original sisters too, she went into trance, and then the soul of Shiv Baba, the Supreme Soul, and the soul of Brahma came together. And we began to know them as Bapdada, a combined form. And they came through and continued the teaching through the medium of Dadi Gulzar. And Brahma Baba actually shared his experience of his own death. So the soul came back 3 days later. And he was saying he did experience a little pain. And he felt really the pull of all the children, because there was such a bond of love with all the BK community, which had grown a lot. But he left his body, and it's like he'd settled all his account. He flew away. And he reached that most elevated state. And that is how that soul is still serving at the moment. And so this is why we have this special meditation during January, not to worship Brahma Baba, not to pray to Brahma Baba, not to even venerate, but to deeply appreciate how one human being conquered his weakness, dealt with all his shortcomings, his weaknesses, his negativity, his impurity. And in a way, we just take his life as an example. But our connection is with the Supreme Soul, as Brahma Baba was always sharing. And so I've tried to encapsulate as much as I can in about 40 minutes. And really, my own feeling, I never met him, but I feel incredibly close to Brahma Baba too, because my connection, I remember the Supreme Soul. And that's the love of my life, to do that. But as we know, in life, we have so many challenges from the world, from our relationships, but mainly from our own nature, our own inner stuff. And what I find is that when I hit a brick wall of something, some issue, some problem, some personal weakness or attitude, I really get incredible inspiration from Brahma Baba, who had this total courage and honesty with himself to be on this extraordinary pilgrimage of self-transformation, to remove my body consciousness and really live in a state of soul consciousness, which is the original state. And all of this, because the more Brahma Baba would teach of us become soul conscious, we're starting to rebuild a new society, and it's the seeds of a new world or a golden age. The cycle keeps spinning. And so even though we're in the end of a period full of darkness and conflict and deep sorrow in the hearts of humanity, and I think a lot of us in this life, I used to sometimes look at our world and just wonder what is happening. The pain in the hearts of humanity is so great. But Baba explained how we are at the end of a period of time. The Iron Age is about to finish. This confluence is the bridge between this old culture based on body consciousness to a new culture based on soul consciousness. And in a sense, the Supreme Soul's part is to come and initiate that, recreate what is already here into a divine society, a golden aged world. And so we make efforts to transform myself so that I can take rebirth in that world in the future. So there we are. And if we have a few minutes, if anyone would like to ask any questions, please feel free. We don't have too much time, and maybe you've got so many questions after that, but I'm sure that Raj and Sareka and others will be only too happy to help you.
Thank you so much, Charlie Bhai, for drawing such a beautiful picture of the life and sacred journey of Brahma Baba. The time just flew by, it's 40 minutes.
It
But
did.
yes, let's see if anybody has any questions. We can see. But how do you think, I was kind of contemplating, especially post-COVID, how do you think that this journey of the spirituality that Brahma Baba initiated such a long time ago is still helping and is going to help heal some sorrow that's so widespread these days? Like, what can we do that can ease that pain and suffering that's going on, and it's so widespread these days?
You know, there's one of the fundamental sort of philosophies, or can you say the slogan of the Brahma Kumaris is, when we change, the world changes. And to me, why is the world like it is? There's 8 billion human souls. And when we have this really difficult relationship with the self, we're completely disconnected from my true self. The influence of those 8 billion minds, it affects my health, my relationships, my family life, my work, the world. It's like a mental pollution from all of us because we've lost and forgotten who we are. And so Brahma Baba encouraged us not to focus on outside, but focus on bringing change in me as you lending your finger to create a better world. Because when many of us begin to resonate on a soul conscious frequency, which is really a frequency of love, a frequency of respect, a frequency of belonging and care, you know, there's really intrinsic human qualities that make life incredibly beautiful. We start to be a seed in our own family, our own community, to bring transformation. And this story, you know, began in this little part of Pakistan, which was India at that time, and has now spread to basically, you know, all over the world, 140 countries plus, millions of people meditating and transforming. But, you know, Navi, I think what is really important now is many of us dabble in this stuff. And it's like we come to a talk like this and we may like it, but then we go back and we just re-engage with my old thinking and my old attitudes. And so then often we take on meditation. We start to say, no, I've got to do something. I've got to change myself, take that responsibility. So we've become very disciplined at meditating, but often as soon as we finish meditating, my mind reverts to its old thinking. I just go back to my old attitudes and my old thinking. And that's where what is really working now, and what Brahma Baba absolutely taught, is to create a spiritual lifestyle, to put a framework into my life where I just don't see meditation as something morning and night. It's an attitude to life. It's a decision that I make that I'm going to live as a peaceful soul. This is my fundamental identity. And wherever I go, I'm going to spread this vibration of peace and goodwill for those around me. we can't underestimate when many of the little lights start sparkling with this consciousness. It has a massive influence, and it's growing and growing and growing. So, I feel that our world is going through a massive change at the moment. And, Brahma Baba inspiring all of us with that slogan, when I change, my family will change, my community will change, my workplace will change. Take the responsibility. It needs a lot of courage to do that. Much easier to point the finger of blame. That's the culture of the world. Everyone else is messing everything up. The whole mess is the politicians or whoever. But not here. I'm responsible for how I feel. That's the message from Brahma Baba.